Sunday, November 17, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minute news. Our guest today is a former public school teacher who ran for re-election as a Democrat to the Texas House of Representatives, representing District 50. He won in the general election on November 5th this year. James Talarico, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thanks for having me back.
Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
That's some good news in this political landscape. And whilst you, James, were successful in your district in Texas, the result wasn't as positive for the Democrats across the country. Let's start by discussing how much of the result of the presidential election do you think was down to disinformation versus an actual reckoning of what America maybe has become under Trumpism, or maybe has always been?
Well, I'm trying in these days after election night to avoid overlearning lessons and underlearning lessons. My political awakening happened after 9/11. I was 12 years old, and in the wake of that horrific tragedy, I became much more politically aware. I got involved in the anti-war movement when I was in high school. I remember participating in a march against the Iraq War here in Austin, Texas, on the South Congress Bridge. It was full of people the night before George W. Bush invaded Iraq. And I remember on election night in 2004, after that immoral, illegal war, George W. Bush won the popular vote. It felt for Democrats and for those who love democracy, it felt like a serious defeat, and it was a serious defeat. And I remember folks saying that Democrats were going to be in the wilderness for a generation, that we would need to support the invasion of Iraq, that we would have to nominate more hawkish candidates if we ever hoped to win an election again. But just 2 years after that 2004 election, Democrats across Texas and across the country won state and local elections. Democrats flipped Congress, and then 2 years after that, Barack Hussein Obama was elected president, an anti-war candidate from Chicago. So there's always hot takes after an election, where the hot take factory is pumping out more takes than ever before over the past week. And that's important. This conversation is really important. It's critical that we as progressives, we as supporters of democracy, look inward and take stock of what needs to change for us to start winning elections again across the country. But I also want us to recognize that our perspective is limited in these days after an election, and that we're going to learn a lot more in the weeks and months ahead. And we should be open to that learning, and then take what comes and adjust our message, our candidates, our outreach to make sure that we are putting ourselves in a position to win again, because that's what we need to do more than anything else.
I felt a little blindsided by the result. I must be honest. I miscalled it. I genuinely thought that the American people could see through Donald Trump, and that they recognized that maintaining democracy here was more important than the price of eggs. And I was wrong. How did it kind of play out for you? Were you convinced that Harris was looking towards a big win, or obviously in Texas it's a very different story for you. So do you feel like you were living in a liberal progressive reality, or the alternative?
Well, I knew that the election was going to be close, and I knew that we were running in a tough environment, as has been stated in these last few days. The phenomenon of incumbent parties losing across the world because of inflation and migration is well documented, and so we were running into the wind, and that's always a difficult place to be in an election cycle. So I knew it would be close. I think Vice President Harris ran a strong campaign with difficult circumstances, with limited time, and I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Vice President Harris for stepping up to lead our party and advocate for democracy and for democratic values in that short window. But all the data suggested that this was going to be a close race, and it ended up being a close race. Donald Trump is going to win the popular vote by a little over a point. The results in the swing states were even closer. So it's important that we recognize how close this election was. Now, I do think we've got to find a way to make sure that our pro-democracy coalition is big enough to where we're not always within a point or two of losing to someone like Donald Trump. And we've got to build a much bigger and more sustainable majority if we're going to build on the American experiment in the years and decades to come. But this was a close race. It was closer than a lot of incumbent parties got in other industrialized Western countries. So there is that context is important, I think, to making sure that we don't overreact to the results on Tuesday night.
We're starting to see quite a lot of regret from people that did vote for Trump, not knowing about some of these extreme policies, like wanting to shut down the Department of Education, for example, where they did feel that, they were voting for him because he was an easy candidate to vote for. Let's be clear. He's the kind of shiny object in the sky. And as time goes on and as his policies play out, and certainly as these cabinet appointments have been announced, a lot of Republicans, but also independent voters who went with Trump, are starting to think, did I do the right thing?
Sure.
For me, this is like echoes of Brexit in the UK, where there was an awful lot of buyer's remorse.
Sure.
How do you think that's going to play out in the coming months?
Yeah, I know a lot of folks are filled with anger and are tempted by hopelessness. It's important to remember that politics is a lot like physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the backlash to Donald Trump and his style of politics is already beginning. As you mentioned, we've seen him appoint a rapist to be our attorney general. We've seen him appoint a spy to be the director of national intelligence. We've seen him appoint a Fox News host to be the Secretary of Defense. We've seen him appoint an anti-vaccine conspiracy theorist to lead our health department. And so this is just the beginning of what promises to be a chaotic and corrupt administration starting in January. And so those of us who still believe in democracy and what it can achieve, we've got to be ready to channel that backlash into something productive. We've got to make sure that we are extending a hand of friendship to those who voted for Donald Trump last week, and make sure that we're inviting them in to join our big coalition, our big tent. And part of that, I think, is avoiding language like maintaining or defending or preserving democracy, because American democracy is a project. It's a promise, an unfulfilled promise. It's something that we are progressing toward. And we can't be in the habit of defending the status quo, because the status quo doesn't work for a lot of people in this country. It doesn't work for a lot of my constituents. And so I'm not interested in preserving anything. I'm not interested in defending anything. I'm interested in building on this democracy that we have so that it can truly work for everyone. And when I say democracy, I don't just mean a political democracy. I don't mean just voting in an election. I mean the ability of people to shape the lives they want in the time that they have on this earth. And that should span not just politics, but our economy and our culture and our ecology. Democracy is an expansive, exciting vision for what humanity can be. And so we can't get in the habit of defending the status quo. Democracy is all about upending the status quo and progressing to something better. I think if we remember that and truly chase that vision of what democracy can be for everyone in this country and everyone in the world, then I think we can excite people and show that democracy is not the problem but the solution, and the way out of our problems is not less democracy but more democracy. That I think is the key to moving forward within our coalition.
I should just say, alleged rapist on the subject of Matt Gaetz. I don't want to get you into any trouble there, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the lineup for his picks has sent shockwaves through Washington, certainly the rest of the country, and much of the rest of the world. We'll come on to those in just a minute. I want to stay on the kind of what went wrong conversation for a minute, because I do feel that you have a lot of insight on this, because you meet people, you door knock, you hold your public meetings. I mean, it is important, isn't it, that we understand that America is not really one country at all. Despite the United States, it does seem increasingly like 50 different countries. And that maybe offers me some solace when I look at this result, because I recognize that depending on where you live, you have a very different experience. For you in Texas, though, which obviously is a red state with a little dappling of blue, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Corpus Christi, these little glimmers of blue.
You just named most of the places where all the people live. So, it certainly has a history of being a red state. Democrats haven't won statewide office since 1994.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, the past election results have been closer than people think. Both 2016, 2020, even on election night last week, Colin Allred came within single digits of defeating Ted Cruz. And so, although it was a tough environment and we saw backsliding across the country, including here in Texas, we're not as red as a lot of folks think. And you just reeled off some of the biggest cities in the country that are solidly blue. And that's a lot of people. That's millions of people in the state of Texas. And for instance, here in the state house, in the lower chamber of the legislature, Democrats control about 45% of the seats in the state House of Representatives. So it's a little more purple than I think people realize. We're not Alabama. We're not Idaho. Texas is a dynamic state with growing urban and suburban populations, and we've even seen that some of our small towns and rural communities have not been trending rightward like a lot of rural communities across the country, because things like private school voucher scams that threaten to close public schools in small towns around the state, the refusal to expand Medicaid is closing rural hospitals around the state. And so I actually think there's an opportunity here to make inroads in our rural communities and our small towns around Texas. So I just say all that because it's important to realize, although we have kind of a stereotypical image as the quintessential red state, the numbers don't quite reflect that reality, although Republicans still are winning statewide elections by a narrow margin.
How much of it being a border state do you think mattered in this election? Because, of course, so much of the rhetoric from the GOP was about mass deportations and about the crisis at the border. Obviously, in Texas, that plays a big part.
Yeah, being a border state is a key part of our identity as Texans. Texas used to be Mexico. My family has been in the state for 8 generations, and so we've been here since it was Mexico. And what we've seen in our border communities is a real outcry for comprehensive immigration reform. Our system is deeply broken, and we've got to change it top to bottom. And I think there was frustration that the Biden administration waited until halfway through an election year to take steps to secure the border. And so we as Democrats have got to be putting forward a vision that reforms this system and reflects our values as a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. The United States is both of those things, and we need immigration reform that speaks to both of those values.
But isn't both of those things the problem with a lot of these policies? Because, we talk about democracy as being something that we have, but we're also working towards.
That's right.
So it's very grey. It's not black and white. And yet so much of the voting was based on this compartmentalization of policies. And I think maybe that's the hardest part of communicating to the electorate about what America is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's just so nuanced.
That's right. And that's why it's really important that we have effective communicators leading our party and leading our coalition. And, unfortunately, we didn't have that in President Biden over the last few years. And so we've got to be able to articulate a message on immigration and articulate real plans and proposals that can solve this problem and create an orderly, safe immigration system, while still recognizing that immigration is a net good for the United States and for our economy. The reason we're a global superpower is because of immigration, because folks from Mexico and folks from Asia and folks from Europe and places like Italy, which is where Talarico comes from, the fact that people want to move to America, want to chase the American dream, want to contribute to this American project, that's a good thing. And we as Democrats should celebrate immigration while also acknowledging that our system is broken and that our borders should be orderly and safe. We don't want chaos on our southern border. It's bad for our country. It's particularly bad for our border communities. And so we should be listening to the folks who live along the Texas-Mexico border, because they've been telling us for years that this system is broken and desperately needs reform. We as Democrats are the ones that should be putting forward those real reforms. I remember when I was on the House floor last legislative session, there was an anti-immigrant bill that would have separated families, would have put razor wire in the Rio Grande to trap women and children and drown folks who are trying to seek a better life. And I said, I am willing to work with anyone at any time to pursue real solutions to this problem, reforming our asylum system, modernizing our ports of entry, making sure that we've got enough resources along the border to facilitate a safe and orderly process. Those are the solutions I think people are hungry for. We don't want to separate families. We don't want to deport people who've lived in our community for decades. We don't want to deny Texas children the right to an education. Those are un-American positions that hopefully we can all reject, while still coming together around common sense solutions to make our border more secure.
Unfortunately, the person who has been tapped for this new role of border czar, to draw a direct comparison to Kamala Harris, who wasn't the border czar, but
that's right, she was not.
Right,
Yeah.
this will obviously draw comparisons in Trump's world. Is Tom Homan, who is the former acting U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Director. He is the architect of the family separations policy and the cages and all of the worst aspects of those policies, and yet he is back with a vengeance. I mean, this really could turn out to be pretty ugly, couldn't it?
Absolutely could. I was a public school teacher before I ran for office, and I taught on the west side of San Antonio, which is a beautiful, historic Mexican-American neighborhood. And I taught a lot of undocumented students. Those students many times were the hardest working, the most conscientious, and the most American students that I had. They understood and believed in the American dream in ways that us native-born citizens sometimes lose touch with. And so my heart breaks for my former students that are undocumented and their families. And I pray every night that the Trump administration will use restraint and will understand our values as a nation of immigrants and not violate people's human rights and break up families and break up communities. I fear that is what will happen, given the promises that have been made and the appointments that have already been made. But all we can do at this point is stay vigilant, get organized, and try to defend our neighbors and our communities when the Trump administration overreaches and violates people's human rights.
The story you tell of these kids that you taught is something we never, ever hear, do we? It never crosses into the media. It doesn't get communicated at all that, firstly, that immigrants are human.
That's right.
Right? Because they're spoken about in such dehumanizing language.
That's right.
Even the phrase illegals I find completely offensive. Yeah. And yet that is the rhetoric. Do you think that to actually put faces to these titles would maybe be more helpful so that we actually got to know who these people are?
Absolutely. And seeing ourselves in them, right?
Right.
My great-grandparents immigrated here from Italy, searching for a better life. And we should see our story in the stories of immigrants today who are coming here to contribute to the United States. Are there folks who are engaging in criminal and violent behavior? Yes, and those folks should be dealt with. But the studies are very clear that undocumented immigrants commit crimes at far lower rates than native-born Americans. There are exceptions, of course, there always are, and those exceptions are oftentimes used by politicians to divide people, to gin up anti-immigrant sentiment so they can win an election. But the data is very clear that most undocumented folks, most immigrants in this country are not committing crimes, but are contributing to our economy. If you want to see inflation get a lot worse, you deport the hardworking immigrants who are picking our fruit, packing our meat, building our highways, building the buildings that we work in. That'll be the fastest way to derail the American economy. Our economic miracle here in the United States is built off the backs of undocumented immigrants. They came here because our economy invited them here. And so until we have that honest conversation about immigration, we are going to continue to lose to demagogues who use immigrants and dehumanize immigrants in order to win elections.
Which they always have. And
nothing new. Nothing new. We saw it with the Irish, saw it with the Italians, we saw it with the Chinese, and we're seeing it today with Mexicans and Central Americans. And again, this is not saying that we don't need dramatic reform to our immigration system. This is not saying we don't need a secure southern border. It's not saying we don't need a safe and orderly process to know who's coming into our country. We as Democrats should be the first to say that government needs to work. We are the anti-chaos party, and we need to proudly say that, while still acknowledging that our country benefits from immigrants who come here to contribute to the American economy. Both things can be true, and we've got to speak to both of those facts if we're going to start winning elections again.
I don't believe it was really said enough that Trump vetoed the immigration bill. That, to me, is obviously a big part of this, that there was bipartisan agreement. There was a huge amount of funding, especially for judges who were looking at these immigration cases, and yet Trump blocked it because he didn't want Joe Biden to have a win. I mean, that is massive, isn't it? And yet, again, people kind of didn't really recognize that was a thing.
And illustrates the entire problem with this debate. People like Donald Trump and Governor Greg Abbott, they want the problem more than they want the solution, because they can campaign on the problem. They can stir up people's anger about the problem. But if Americans really want a solution to our immigration system, then we've got to start talking about things that can actually fix this. And that is things like more immigration judges, more border patrol, modernized ports of entry so we can detect fentanyl when it comes through the ports of entry, which, by the way, 93% of the fentanyl that gets into this country comes through the ports of entry. And because we don't have the technology to detect it, it's getting through and killing Americans. There are real solutions that we could pursue in this issue area. But I think politicians on the right don't want solutions. They want the problem, because that's how they win elections.
We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and look at some more of these appointments that Trump has made and see how it kind of might change the face of America. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. And now a message from me to you that comes from the heart, and I'm talking about the actual heart. Yes, the makers of Superbeats Heart Chews believe the cardiovascular system is the force that unlocks the best parts of life, and your heart is at its center. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the antioxidants in Superbeats are clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. I, personally, want to be around for my kids for many, many more years, and it's great to know that I'm doing something good for myself every day. Cardiovascular health matters because it connects your heart to every part of your body, trusted by cardiologists right across the country and real people like you. The #1 doctor, pharmacist, and cardiologist recommended Beat brand for cardiovascular health support and the clinically studied ingredients to help you support your cardiovascular health. Superbeats are a convenient way to support healthy blood pressure with no pills to swallow, no ingredients to mix or prepare, just simple, plant-based active ingredients. Power the moments your heart beats for with Superbeats Heart Chews and get 15% off and save even more on bundles using code WEEKEND at getsuperbeats.com. That's getsuperbeets.com and use code WEEKEND. I'm excited to tell you about Moink. That's Moo plus Oink. Moink is a meat subscription box company on a mission to fight for the family farm. They're located in rural America, run by an 8th-generation female farmer. Their animals are raised humanely, their employees are paid a living wage, and the quality of their product is better than anything you'll find in a store. Moink delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef and lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and sustainable wild-caught Alaskan salmon straight to your door. Moink farmers farm like our grandparents did, and as a result, Moink meat tastes like it should, because the family farm does it better, and the Moink difference is a difference you can taste. Unlike the supermarket, Moink gives you total control over the quality and source of your food. You can choose the meat delivered in every box, like ribeyes to chicken breasts, pork chops to salmon fillets, and much more. Plus, you can cancel any time. Moink is helping to save rural America. Join the Moink movement today. Keep American farming going by signing up at moinkbox.com/weekend right now. And listeners to this show get free hot rolls in your first box. The best hot rolls you'll ever taste, but for a limited time. Spelt MOINK box.com/weekend. That's moinkbox.com/weekend. We're back on the Weekend Show with James Talarico. Matt Gaetz is kind of the name that people are really talking about for all the wrong reasons this week, and RFK Jr. at Health and Human Services. We'll come on to him in just a moment, but Matt Gaetz to me was always like a joke character in Congress, right? With this kind of increasing, I don't know what was going on up here, but he was starting to look like Ming the Merciless, and yet, the choice for him as Attorney General to replace Merrick Garland is remarkable in so many ways. The conspiracy is that, Trump is purposely putting imbeciles into these roles in order to deconstruct the administrative state, which effectively goes back to Steve Bannon's plan from a decade ago, whereby America cannot remain this superpower with these clowns holding these senior positions. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I do. I think there's a temptation to think that Trump is playing some kind of 4-dimensional chess. Trump is being his impulsive, chaotic self, the same person he's been for 80 years. And we have to take that seriously. Some of us are trying to convince ourselves that maybe he doesn't actually mean what he says. Maybe he's actually not going to follow through on his promises to use the power of the state to persecute his political enemies. We've got to take him at his word. And I think these initial appointments, just in a few days after election night, are indications that he intends to follow through on his dangerous promises. Matt Gaetz being at the top of that list. So we've got to we can't afford to normalize this. In a lot of ways, election night was normal, meaning when there's global inflation, you're going to see a backlash to the incumbent party. That's a normal dynamic of politics. And then there are a lot of ways that this was not normal. The fact that there was a twice impeached insurrectionist regaining power, someone who tried to commit a coup on January 6th, 2021, that's not normal. Appointing someone like Matt Gaetz to lead the Department of Justice, appointing a Fox News host to lead the Department of Defense, that is not normal. And so we cannot afford to become complacent and to normalize this behavior. We've got to muster the energy to stay outraged and communicate with our fellow citizens about the dangers that lie ahead.
But there are some people that loved the fact that he was an insurrectionist, and they love the fact that he was an adjudicated rapist or is an adjudicated rapist, and then they love the fact that he's a business fraudster and that he's a convicted felon. In fact, James, those are the reasons why they voted for him. And that is this kind of living in the upside down bit that I think a lot of us who sit in a more kind of progressive space cannot get our heads around, because, we believe that the rule of law is essential and important. That used to be something that the GOP always talked about, right? But they've just elected a completely lawless individual to be the president, and so that kind of changes the rules all over.
Well, I live and work with Republicans every single day here in the state of Texas, and in my job as a legislator. And so I don't get to sit in a progressive space like some of our friends in the coalition. And so I can tell you that folks voted for Donald Trump. Many folks voted for Donald Trump despite those things. Of course, you're absolutely right. There is a hardcore MAGA part of that coalition that loves the fact that he tried to kill his vice president on January 6th and encouraged a violent mob to attack the Capitol. Those folks exist, and we should be clear-eyed about that. But I want to separate that far right contingency with the movable middle, folks who are worried about what happened on January 6th, folks who are worried about his lawlessness, but made the decision, whether it was informed or not, to prioritize inflation and migration over those concerns about democracy or reproductive justice. People can hold both views at the same time and prioritize them differently. Those are the folks that we've got to reach. Those are the folks we've got to invite back into our coalition if we are going to save and build on the American experiment in the 21st century. So that, I think, is an important distinction as we try to figure out how to move forward as a party and as a coalition to win again in 2026 and 2028.
So let's talk about that, this regrouping for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Because at the moment it feels pretty leaderless, it feels pretty rudderless. I said it was like being on a ship in the middle of the ocean without a captain.
That's right.
I would have liked for Vice President Kamala Harris to have continued her campaign even after she conceded, just as a figurehead to give us some guidance, because a lot of Democrats are hurting right now. They really are feeling great sadness for what America is going to look like come January next year. Yeah. Aside from a likely federal abortion ban, aside from the education department that we're hearing about, aside from mass deportations, just this feeling that this terrible person was chosen by the American people has really upset a lot of people, not least women, minorities, people from the LGBTQ plus community, and those of us who might be white and male but are also feminists and great allies of those groups. So does someone need to step up right now?
I actually have a different take. I think that this vacuum is healthy. I think the Democratic Party needs to go through a little time in the wilderness. The wilderness is a helpful place sometimes. As we've talked before about my religious faith. Oftentimes in the great faith traditions, there are stories of people like Jesus and Moses and Buddha and Muhammad spending time in the literal wilderness. And that is a place where you can meet great wisdom and great enlightenment. That's true for political parties, in a sense. Being in the wilderness is a place of creativity and experimentation. It's a place where new ideas and new leaders come forth. That's exactly what the Democratic Party needs right now. I am, in some ways, of course, I desperately hoped for a different outcome on election night, but I think this result will force the Democratic Party to elevate new leaders and new voices and new ideas. I'm grateful for the 80-year-old standard bearers that have led us through the past 2 decades, the Clintons and the Bidens and the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers of our party. But I think we're ready to move on from that. I think it's time for a new generation of leadership to take the reins. And the only way we can truly do that is to have a time of disruption, a time in the wilderness to experiment and find new energy. So I actually think this is a healthy time. Grief can be fertile soil. If you just think about it, if your listeners think about it, most of the songs and the art that you find the most moving, most of that was born out of times of despair and darkness. I always think about the word emergency. The root of that word is emerge. Something comes out of times like this. There is hope in that darkness, and it's something we should embrace as a party over the next few weeks and months.
You see, even a sermon can be helpful in times
right.
like this.
We all need a sermon.
Because I'm very much in Superman's fortress of solitude.
Sure.
And maybe that's where we need to, as you say, remain for a short time.
That's right. You can learn a lot in the fortress of solitude.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the leadership of the Democratic Party, because, you mentioned some of the kind of elder statesmen and women.
Sure. Yeah.
But there is a lot of talk about the fact that it's time for new blood, and that people like Chuck Schumer should not be continuing. Nancy Pelosi was re-elected, and there is a lot, and she was the architect of arguably of Joe Biden stepping down and stepping aside for Kamala Harris's run. So there are clearly, and there is a lot of great new blood coming through, isn't there? We have some really amazing people who are in the Washington orbit, not least Hakeem Jeffries. So who do you think has the skill set and the energy to step up?
And I want to make clear, Nancy Pelosi is one of the most successful legislators in American history. So this is nothing to denigrate the accomplishments of
and
our
fundraisers as well.
That's right. That's right. And I believe that Joe Biden has an impressive legislative agenda that rivals that of LBJ and Franklin Roosevelt. And I think with time we will appreciate exactly what Joe Biden has done for this country. So it's really important that we honor our elders in the party and what they've done for this country. That said, I think they would probably be the first to admit that we need new and exciting energy from a new generation. And so, I see, a lot of exciting candidates from around the country. People like Raphael Warnock in Georgia really excites me for how people of faith in the Democratic coalition can start to talk explicitly about their faith and their values. Obviously, Secretary Pete Buttigieg is someone that I look up to and think is an excellent communicator. People that are even younger than that, millennials and Gen Z at the state and local level are really exciting to watch. And I hope that they get an opportunity to have their voice heard by a national audience in the years to come. So this is an exciting time. It's certainly a scary time, and things are going to get bad, and people are going to get hurt. But I want to recognize that in that darkness, something new can be born, and we should encourage that and not avoid the discomfort that comes from being in the wilderness.
Let's talk for a moment about your faith and Christianity in America, because we've spoken before about Christian nationalism and trying to make a clear separation so people understand the difference. But again, like the other things we've been talking about, borders or democracy or immigrants. It's like nothing is black and white. But there is an ascendant fundamentalist religious movement whose leaders believe that the United States is a Christian nation and the Constitution is based on the Bible and that Christians are called to take over the government. And they have found an ally in Donald Trump, who is not a religious person, as we know. And so this movement, this growing movement that believes that Trump is fighting a spiritual war against demonic forces within the US. And he even said in his acceptance speech that God spared my life, and that, you know, he was to restore America to greatness with that kind of offering. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, isn't there? So how do we understand that kind of separation between moderate Christianity and religious extremism?
Well, we could spend a whole podcast talking about this, and
I got all the time in the world.
And you and I have spoken at length about this. It's such an important topic, maybe the central topic to talk about when we're trying to understand this new fascism in America. There's an old saying that when fascism comes to the United States, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross. One thing I think is important to recognize is that this is nothing new in human history. It's nothing new in Christianity. 300 years after Jesus was executed by the Roman Empire, Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official state religion of that very same empire. So the powers that be have always tried to domesticate and manipulate Christianity for their own ends. And this is true across traditions. You see Hindu nationalism on the rise in India. Obviously, we know what Islamic extremism can do in the Middle East. Folks who pervert these beautiful religious traditions to consolidate their own wealth and power is not a new phenomenon, but it is one that we need to confront directly. You know, Jesus gives us an important teaching, which is that before you take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye, you need to take the log out of your own. It's a helpful teaching because it encourages self-reflection. And I think it's important for those of us on the pro-democracy side. Again, I try not to say Democrat because there are Republicans, brave Republicans here in Texas and across the country who are still standing up for small d democratic values, and I don't want to erase their contributions and their sacrifice. So those of us who believe in democracy, we have got to reclaim faith. We've got to reclaim religious values. We've got to get comfortable talking explicitly about our values and our faith, regardless of what that faith may be. We have ceded religion to the far right for about 50 years in this country. The late 70s, early 80s is when the religious right as a political movement really started to form. The Jerry Falwells, the Pat Robertsons, the Ronald Reagans of the world. And they decided that the way back to power in the wake of the New Deal and Great Society coalition was to use religion to push an extreme far-right political agenda. And it was an impressive accomplishment, because to be able to use the teachings of Jesus to push trickle-down economics, that doesn't seem like an easy thing to do, but they pulled it off. Right. To make abortion and homosexuality the two most important issues for religious voters, when both of those issues don't appear in the Bible, when both of those issues never come out of the mouth of Jesus, that's an impressive accomplishment. That is impressive propaganda. And that they played the long game, right? After Roe v. Wade, it took them 50 years to overturn it. And we are reckoning with the fruits of that tree as we speak. It was a concerted effort to reclaim the teachings of Jesus, which historically had been associated with compassion and justice and love for our neighbors. It was a concentrated effort to take those teachings and use it for the benefit of the wealthy and the powerful. If we're going to combat this, if we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole, we, as people who love democracy, have got to get comfortable reclaiming religion, reclaiming faith. That is the only way out of this. We've got to recognize the role that we played in allowing this to happen. Christian nationalism is like a weed in the garden. And if you allow your garden to fall apart, that weed is going to start taking over the entire garden. And that's what exactly has happened here in this country. And I'm glad we're finally having this conversation, but it is long overdue.
I mean, a lot of this goes back to Steve Bannon's original plans. I mean, he really says all the quiet parts out loud and has never not told us what he planned. And in fact, Vice President Harris said about Project 2025, I can't believe they wrote that stuff down. But
Right.
but the plans floated by Christian nationalist leaders include, as we've said earlier, the abolition of the education department, which they see as a threat to faith-based learning. Same for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. They want LGBTQ plus literature, especially anything referencing transgender people, classified as pornography, part of a book banning campaign that has already led to hundreds of books being taken out of school libraries, and some even seeking the death penalty for women who have abortions. I mean, this is medieval by any strength of the imagination, and yet this is what people just voted for.
That's right. You mentioned earlier that Donald Trump is not religious, and I feel like that is apparent to anyone who has watched Donald Trump over the past few years. I'm not even sure he's ever opened a Bible, even the Bibles that he has branded and sold himself. Maybe he's
Right,
opened
yes.
it to sign a copy for someone, but
Yeah.
I doubt he's ever actually read Scripture. But Donald Trump is surrounded by religious extremists. And if we know anything about Donald Trump, it's that he's transactional to his core. And as long as those religious extremists give him power, he'll give them their policies, just like he did when he overturned Roe v. Wade. You know, in Project 2025, they are talking about a national ban on abortion. They're talking about banning contraception and IVF. Some of the authors of Project 2025 have talked about banning what they call recreational sex. And so, in my view, this is the Christian Taliban. They are perverting my beloved religious tradition and using that to subvert our American democracy. For those in blue states, Project 2025 is theoretical. But for those of us who are living in red states, Project 2025 is already here. It's happening in places like the Texas legislature. They're testing these ideas in red states before they take them nationwide. So as a legislator here in Texas, I can tell the rest of the country what's coming. A bill to force every teacher to display the Ten Commandments, which we saw here at the Texas Capitol. A bill to replace school counselors with untrained, unsupervised religious chaplains, which we saw here at the Texas Capitol. A bill to defund neighborhood public schools to subsidize private Christian schools. And most recently, what we saw here in Texas was a new state curriculum that teaches Christian Bible stories as historical fact to our youngest students. You know, the right is fond of saying that education is the goal, not indoctrination. I have to agree. Schools are about education, not indoctrination. What you're seeing from the far right, what you're seeing in Project 2025, is classic indoctrination of our youngest kids. And all of us should be outraged, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're religious or not. This should offend our values as Americans, and it should offend our values as people of faith. My faith teaches me to look out for the least of these, to love my neighbors regardless of their religion, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their immigration status. And so I find these bills not to only be un-American and unconstitutional, but also deeply un-Christian.
The Muslim ban, which he has threatened will return, forms part of this Christian nationalist playbook, doesn't it? Because they do see themselves as Christian soldiers against the Muslim world.
Yeah.
And you know, the Muslim ban made no sense the first time. It wasn't based on anything. In fact, I seem to remember him saying, we are going to ban all Muslims from entering the United States until we can work out what the hell is going on. And it was clear to me that he didn't know what the hell was going on.
Yeah.
This is another example of Christian nationalism masquerading as public policy.
That's exactly right. And the most tragic part is that Christians and Muslims and Jews all worship the same God. Muslims love Jesus. They love Moses and Abraham. We are all branches on the same tree as the Abrahamic faith. And so it's heartbreaking to watch extremists, whether they are Christian nationalists or whether they're the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, perverting these beautiful traditions that have so much in common to attack others and consolidate their own power. This is a tale as old as time, but it doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to speak out against it and reclaim these traditions for their original values of peace and love and justice. We've got to get back to that in our traditions. This is not just a political problem. This is also a theological problem. It's part of why I enrolled in seminary, in addition to my public service here at the Capitol. This battle needs to be fought on both fronts, both in the halls of state capitals and our national capital, but also in churches and mosques and synagogues and temples. We've got to be able to get back to a healthy religion, a healthy theology that allows us to love one another despite our differences, rather than pursue earthly power.
Let's talk about a Christian nationalist who has been given a senior role in this administration. We mentioned him briefly earlier. This is the Fox News host Pete Hegseth as the new Secretary of Defense. In the last few days, his tattoos have been revealed. The strangest array of body art. A cross with a blade to represent Matthew 10:34, a cherry-picked version of Jesus as warrior, popular with Christian nationalists. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword, it says, and a Jerusalem cross inked, a symbol of Crusaders' holy war against Muslims and Jews. This is terrifying for those of us who kind of live hopefully in a safe, moderate space. Would it have been better if he kept his shirt on and kept quiet about it, or is it healthy that we know?
I think a public disclosure of some of these extremist beliefs is helpful as we enter his confirmation stage. I just want to clarify, because I know we've got listeners who are not Christian or not religious. That verse where Jesus says, I come not to bring peace but a sword, if it's put in context, you understand that Jesus is talking about the divisions that love creates. If you pursue the radical love of Jesus Christ, a love that includes everyone, including people of different faiths and different races and different cultures, then that will create divisions. It's what got Jesus killed. It's what got Dr. King killed. It's what got Oscar Romero and Dietrich Bonhoeffer killed. It causes divisions. Jesus says that it will cause family members to experience divisions within the household. Choosing the way of radical and universal love is not going to be popular, and will always lead to division because it requires you to take a stand on behalf of your neighbor. So the fact that some people would take that metaphor of a sword to mean literally a weapon, the kind of weapons that Jesus explicitly told us to put away, right? Jesus tells us to put away our swords. Jesus encourages the way of nonviolence. He showed us that when he voluntarily went to the cross, to the Roman cross. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of Scripture and a misuse of Scripture. Anyone who understands the New Testament could easily tell you what that metaphor is referring to, and to try to manipulate that to somehow say that Jesus endorses violence or encourages violence does such violence to the religion of Jesus Christ. And so it's deeply troubling when someone like that is going to be elevated to such an important position. One thing I wanted to tell you, Anthony, you may not know this. Pete Hegseth and I actually have a bit of a history, so your listeners can go look this up on YouTube. But when I went to Washington D.C. with 56 of my fellow Texas Democrats to protest the voter suppression bill here in Texas, I went on Pete Hegseth's Fox News program to talk about voter suppression in Texas and the need for federal voting rights legislation. And in that exchange, I challenged Pete on his own program to admit that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and he refused to do so. That exchange between me and Pete Hegseth went viral. And I think it may have helped him land this new gig, because what's clear is that Donald Trump's only criteria in selecting cabinet officials is not competence, not experience, it is loyalty. And so when Pete Hegseth, in the interview with me, refused to acknowledge the fact that Donald Trump lost the election, that proved his ultimate loyalty to Donald Trump. And that may be why he's being appointed Secretary of Defense. So I'm not sure how I feel about my own small role in Pete Hegseth's ascendancy, but it doesn't make it any less dangerous.
But what's also interesting is how damaged individuals have to be to accept a role that they are wholly unqualified for.
That's right.
So you or I would go, no thanks, we don't have the experience.
Right.
We don't want to handle a $900 billion budget or 2.5 million employees. It's out of our league. Get a military general, get somebody who has the experience and the know-how and understands the theater of war. But this guy, who was briefly in the military and, as you say, is a Fox News weekend host, is like, bring it on.
Yeah.
I mean, that is interesting to me.
Well, I think Donald Trump and those around him care about one thing, and that is power. They don't care about service. They don't care about their neighbors. They care about accumulating wealth and power for themselves. And so this is in alignment with that worldview. And it's one that we've got to challenge directly. We sometimes in our politics get too focused on the personalities, and we pay too little attention to the toxic ideas that underpin so many of these political figures. And so the worship of power is essential to understanding Donald Trump, understanding Christian nationalism, and we've got to get back to a place where elected officials are focused on serving others and putting other people first. That's exactly what my faith teaches me to do. The greatest among you will be a servant, will be those who are a slave to others. That's exactly the kind of spirit that used to characterize elected officials in this country, and that is no longer the case, unfortunately.
We have to take another quick break, but I want to come back and have a kind of holistic conversation about how we kind of cope with the next administration and what's next for the Democrats. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Lomi might just be the smartest appliance I own. It's like having an eco-friendly assistant that handles all my food waste. Lomi lets me turn my food scraps into dirt with a push of a button. It's a countertop electric composter that takes my waste and transforms it into nutrient-rich dirt in less than 4 hours. I run it while I sleep, just like my dishwasher. No more smelly bins, and it's so quiet you barely notice it's running. Since I got my Lomi, I'm taking out way less garbage. I used to struggle with 3 full bags of trash every week. Now I'm down to just 1. What I love most is how much waste I'm keeping out of landfill. Less trash means less methane, and with Lomi, I'm turning that waste into nutrient-rich dirt that my plants absolutely love. If you're ready to start making a positive environmental impact and make cleanup a breeze. If you're ready to start making a positive environmental impact and make cleanup a breeze, Lomi is exactly what you need. Head over to lomi.com/weekend and use promo code WEEKEND to get $50 off your Lomi. That's $50 off when you go to lomi.com/weekend and use promo code WEEKEND at checkout. Say goodbye to food waste and hello to a cleaner, greener kitchen with Lomi. And with the holidays coming up, Lomi makes the perfect gift for someone on your shopping list. When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Alo or Allbirds or Skims, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. And the not-so-secret secret, with Shop Pay that boosts conversions by up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going... So, if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/weekend to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/weekend. We're back with Representative James Talarico. I'm Anthony Davis. This is The Weekend Show. So as we come to terms with this result, I think for a lot of people it hasn't really kind of maybe kicked in that it is a reality. I mean, Kamala Harris's slogan was, "We're not going back," and yet that is precisely what is going to happen to America come January, mid-January. And so we can talk from a spiritual perspective as well, because I always find this so interesting. And I'm not a person of faith myself, as you know, but, I like you, I'm so open to anything that helps. And I think, we all subscribe to some kind of higher power, no matter how you name it or define it. But we're going to need a lot of help in the coming months and years, aren't we? Because some have argued that Trump will redesign our political system, our constitution, so that we might not even get the chance to vote again, as we have traditionally. Is it that bad, or can we kind of hold on to some remnants of democracy?
It might be that bad. And the fact that there is a less than zero chance that it could get that bad, it should be alarming.
Yeah.
And we've seen this in countries around the world. Bolsonaro in Brazil. We've seen it with Viktor Orban in Hungary. We've seen, Vladimir Putin in Russia. What's important to remember is that these countries didn't stop being democracies overnight. It wasn't some cataclysmic, violent event. It happens gradually. One day you wake up and you're no longer living in a real democracy. It doesn't mean they don't vote. People in Russia vote. It's been rigged to where there's no opposition, and Vladimir Putin wins every election. And so it's a democracy in name only. That's what we may be headed toward. We have to take that possibility very seriously, because Donald Trump has already shown a disdain for our Constitution, including the most central parts of that Constitution, like the peaceful transfer of power. And you saw just days ago that Donald Trump was making suggestions that he may try to run again for a third term. We can't underestimate the willingness of Donald Trump to do even more violence to our Constitution. So I want to be clear-eyed about that. I don't want to be an alarmist, but I also want us to be realistic about the threat that we may be facing. To answer your first question about how do we sustain ourselves in this long fight, you brought up spirituality, and I think this is central. This is key. You said, Anthony, you're not a person of faith, but obviously you do put your faith and your trust in something. You're committed to this public service. I believe this podcast is a form of public service.
Well, I did put my faith in the American people.
That's right. Well, and that's right. And that's why it's important to put our faith into something a little deeper, because people will always disappoint. And that's me included. I'm a finite, flawed human being, just like the rest of us. And I will always disappoint others, unfortunately. I wish I was perfect, but I'm not. So we can't always put our faith in each other. We've got to put our faith into something a little deeper than that. And whether you call that God, whether you call it the cosmos, whether you call it love or justice, that's where we've got to root ourselves. And if you're watching this program and you do not belong to some kind of community that is rooted in that deeper well of of love and compassion, then I encourage you to find that. It doesn't have to be a church, it doesn't have to be a synagogue or a mosque or a temple. It can be a yoga group. It can be a book club. But find yourself a community of other people where you can wrestle with ultimate questions. Not questions about what's going on in the news or how do we win this next election. Those are important questions, they are. But you need a space where you can talk about what does it mean to be a human being? How do we sustain ourselves in the darkness? What is hope? And how do we hang on to hope? Those are the big central questions of the human experience. And if you are not asking those questions, if you're not asking those questions in a community of people, then you're not going to be able to sustain yourself in this dark time. We forget our history, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the farm workers movement. These were all deeply rooted in spirituality. The American civil rights movement was an explicitly Christian movement. All the leaders, including Dr. King, were Christian ministers. And the church, the Black church, was the center of community organizing and community transformation and sustaining themselves, even though their churches were being bombed and their children were being killed. They were able to sustain themselves through that darkness because they were rooted in something so much deeper than the day-to-day news cycle. That needs to be done in community. In our kind of Western individualized, atomized culture, there's a tendency to think that you can do spirituality on your own as a private individual. But I think human history proves otherwise, that you need to be with other people because things get difficult and we've got to rely on one another in community. So that would be my advice to those who are watching. If you don't have a community like that, or maybe you haven't been to a community like that in a while, maybe use this opportunity, this time in the wilderness, to reconnect with those deeper roots, because that's the only way that we can sustain action when things get difficult.
I knew you'd be the right person to ask that question to at this moment in time, and I'm grateful for the answer. People is a wonderful solution to this, isn't it? This idea that a sense of togetherness and feeling like we are not alone.
That's right.
And whilst millions of people obviously voted for Donald Trump, from the purists to those who were deceived, there were still millions of people that voted against him.
Yep, about half the country. Yeah,
right. And against the rise of fascism and against the hate and the abuse and the negativity. And those people, whilst we are hurting, we still exist.
That's right. And it's important to realize that the majority of Americans did not vote for Donald Trump. We're still counting the final votes out of some of the Western states like California, but it is already clear that Donald Trump will win with less than a majority. And so I hope that is comforting to folks, that a majority of this country did not vote for Donald Trump or his vision for America. Now, I'd like to get to a point where we are not in danger of someone like Donald Trump winning an outright majority. I think he is way too close to winning an outright majority, and clearly it was enough to win the Electoral College and win the popular vote, and that should be unacceptable in the United States of America. So we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to go inward and do some serious self-reflection and listen to the folks who didn't vote with us this time. Mr. Rogers has this saying that the first act of love is listening. That's true in my relationships, in my personal life. I'm sure it's true for you, Anthony, in your relationships. That needs to be true in our political relationships too. There is a tendency right now to see our neighbors as our enemies. Donald Trump promises to destroy his enemies, but my faith teaches me to love my enemies. And when you love your enemies, you enter into a relationship with them, a true relationship, where you can listen, you can learn, and you can ultimately come together. And that enemy is no longer your enemy. They become your friend and your neighbor. That's the kind of transformation we need to be after if we're going to come back from this. It's very tempting to write people off. It's very tempting to say that others are irredeemable. But that is not a way to to live in a democracy, and it's not a way to win. A loving stance is a winning stance. I know it's easier said than done, but it is the only way out of this. And so I would encourage you and your listeners to stay in relationship with people who voted the other way. Listen, learn, and start to rebuild that trust so that we can save and build on this American democratic experiment.
Let's explain the Electoral College result for those who don't quite get it, because it is very complex, right? Trump has won 312 seats to Harris's 226.
Yeah.
He is using these numbers to claim that he has a mandate, a clear mandate, in his words, to enact all of these horrific anti-democratic policies that we're about to have to deal with. What you're saying is that he did not win in a landslide as he claims.
That's right.
So just explain to people who are still kind of wrestling with this how that works.
Well, math can be tricky, as we all know. And of course, that was an impressive Electoral College win. But you can get an impressive Electoral College win by narrowly winning several swing states. In this case, Donald Trump was able to win all 7 of the critical swing states, but he won them by tiny margins, 1 or 2 or 3 points. And so it can be an incredibly close election, which this one was. Donald Trump is going to win with 49% of the vote, which means the majority of Americans voted for someone else. And he beat Kamala Harris in the popular vote by only a little over a point. So this was a small win, but it led to a large Electoral College win because these swing states are winner take all. So you can win with 50% of the vote and take all of the Electoral College votes from a certain state. So that's why the math can be a little tricky. I tend to look at what is the popular vote margin. How did most Americans vote? That, to me, is the instructive data point. It's not how many states did you win narrowly? It's how many votes did you win nationally? And in that case, we have to recognize this was a very close election in a very difficult political environment. And to me, that doesn't add up to a decisive mandate.
How should people handle, you talk about people coming together, even with people who voted for the other side.
Right.
But how should people face off with people who are really like rubbing their noses in it? Because it's hard to manage. There's a lot of rhetoric floating around, and the discourse is such, it's like, you guys, you're living in a fantasy world. That's not what America wants. And now we have our true king. And obviously that is hard for people to deal with. And we're seeing this even within families, even at the breakfast table.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for people who are actually facing these types of criticisms and these gotcha moments head on?
First, I should acknowledge this is very difficult work. It is not easy. I have family members that voted for Donald Trump. I have friends who voted for Donald Trump. And that vote, whether it was done enthusiastically, whether it was done because of our media ecosystem and disinformation online, regardless of why it was done, that vote will have consequences. It'll mean that my former students on the west side of San Antonio who are undocumented may be deported. Their family members may be deported. It'll mean that women across the country are denied their basic human right of bodily autonomy. It'll mean that healthcare is stripped from millions of Americans. It'll mean that billionaires are getting tax cuts at the expense of working people. And it may mean that our fight against climate change is moving backwards, and our planet will become unlivable in the generations to come. So that vote has very real and deadly consequences for our neighbors. We should not discount that. We should not sweep that under the rug. We should see it. We should confront it face to face and be honest about it. But we should also recognize that the folks who cast that vote are just as human as you are. We are not that different from our opponents. I promise you, if I watched Fox News all day long, if I fell down right-wing YouTube algorithmic rabbit holes, I probably would have voted for Donald Trump too. We are susceptible to the same disinformation and the same manipulation. And so that should hopefully invoke in us a compassion for our opponents. And that compassion is an opportunity to stay in relationship and to enter into conversation. Of course, if you've got people who are rubbing your nose in it and who are flaunting it, that can be difficult. And maybe you cool off for a little while before you start that conversation. But this country that elected Donald Trump is the same country that elected Barack Obama. This state that I live in that elected Ted Cruz is the same state that elected Ann Richards. The same people, same state, same country. Don't give up on your neighbors. That is the work of democracy. That is the work of peace. And it's the work that we are called to engage in as citizens of this country.
Do you think that Joe Biden did the right thing welcoming Donald Trump into the Oval Office, shaking his hand and sitting and discussing the peaceful transfer of power in front of the cameras? Because a lot of Democrats were quite saddened by that moment.
This is a difficult question. I don't believe that we should mirror Donald Trump's actions and words. There is a tendency to want to fight fire with fire. I get that tendency. But any firefighter will tell you that you don't fight fire with fire. That only grows the fire. So we cannot play their game. We're never going to win at their game. We have to change the game. And so when it comes to Joe Biden's actions, I think inviting Trump to the Oval Office is the right thing to do. But I think if I were President Biden, I would have used that opportunity to clearly and honestly and aggressively call out what happened on January 6th, 2021, what happened in the last transition. Love doesn't sweep conflict under the rug. It doesn't ignore conflict. True love heals conflict. And so if we're going to love our enemies, if Joe Biden is going to love his enemy, then that requires a brave and courageous confrontation with our enemies while still validating their full humanity. That's a difficult line to walk. It's one that the practitioners of nonviolence, whether it was Dr. King or Mahatma Gandhi, have walked very successfully. We should take a page out of their playbook. We don't give up on our opponents. We don't write them off. We don't mirror their dehumanizing tactics. But we also cannot ignore what's happening. We have to speak boldly and honestly about it. So I think Joe Biden missed an opportunity with Trump's visit to the White House. Not saying he shouldn't have invited him, but using that opportunity to call out and call in, I think may have been a more effective and a more profound and powerful use of that White House visit.
Finally, James, Trump says Americans who don't support him are the enemy and are a bigger problem than China and Russia. He says these are bad people, these are sick people. Do you think that rhetoric might dissipate in favor of him attempting to be a president for all Americans?
Well, I don't say this sarcastically, I sincerely pray that is what happens. I pray all the time for God to change Donald Trump's heart. Donald Trump was made in the image of God, just like you and I, Anthony. That's my belief in my faith. It doesn't mean that human beings don't stray from that calling. It doesn't mean they don't desecrate that image of God within themselves. I believe that's what has happened to Donald Trump over his lifetime. But it doesn't mean that it's too late for him. I do think that compassion and love can still change him. It doesn't mean I hold out hope that will happen. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prepared for him to be his worst self in the Oval Office. But if we can feel that compassion for Donald Trump, if we can love Donald Trump, then that means that we can love his supporters. It means we can love our neighbors who voted a different way. And that is the only salvation that we can put our hope in. If we become like Donald Trump, if we try to destroy our enemies, then we're no better. And then we just descend into a spiral of retribution and violence. So we've got to be better than that. Dorothy Day, I'll leave you with this quote. Dorothy Day is the famous Catholic labor organizer here in the United States. And she had this quote where she said, "I only really love God as much as I love the person I love the least." And for those who are watching your program, I'm sure Donald Trump fits that bill, and for good reason. But we cannot fall victim to the same dehumanizing, tribal, divisive politics that has propelled him to the White House. We can't play that game. We have to change the game.
Okay. Thank you for now, Representative James Talarico.
Thank you, Anthony.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. You can see more from me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, and I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.